In this video, we're really going to focus on the compelling questions and the supporting questions that make up a lesson plan or a unit plan. And we're going to take the actual summative performance task that I built in the last video, and we're going to use that to figure out exactly how we could change an existing supporting question in order to make it better. All right, so before we move into our actual curriculum design, I wanted to jump into the C3 framework so we can really see what a good definition of a compelling question and supporting question is. So here we are in Dimension 1, developing questions and planning inquiries. And if we scroll down, we see that it starts talking about these questions and the desire to answer them as being important to inquiry in the C3 framework. And down here it gives us our definitions. Compelling questions focus on enduring issues and concerns. They deal with curiosities about how things work, interpretations and applications of disciplinary concepts, unresolved issues that require students to construct arguments in response. So we really see what the point of this is, and we go all the way back to our second video where we talk about creating that end task that's really relevant to what's happening today. And we want students to be able to ask questions that will help drive them to that end task. So that's a compelling question. And in contrast, supporting questions are down here. And we have them say focus on descriptions, definitions, and processes on which there is general agreement within the social studies disciplines. I'll stop there. So the idea is compelling question is very open-ended. Think of the big how and why questions. We would want students to have a little bit of their own say. There should not be a very easy answer for them to get, whereas supporting questions are going to help drive them through that inquiry. So what important definitions are they going to need to know? What kind of basic concepts will they need to understand? Really think of those simple tasks that are going to be necessary, especially for younger students. What are some things that they might be exposed to for the very first time in their life? Older students, we would hope that maybe something that would need to be repeated. And then we even have some examples right here, and I'll let you read those on your own time. So if you want to pause me at any moment, you're always welcome to. But we see here, we have some examples, and if we keep scrolling down, there's even more examples. So again, it's actually a pretty short chapter. If you want to pause me and read all of this, it won't take you too long. And if we scroll down, we'll actually see some of our actual standards and examples. So right here, we have constructing compelling questions. We can see here in grades 3 through 5, that would be the goals that we'd be wanting to work with. So for compelling questions, for example, we'd want students to be able to explain why the compelling questions or question is important to others. So if a student asks a question about the curriculum, they would need to be able to explain it to their peer as to why they think it's important, or maybe to an adult. And if you remember in the lesson plan that we're working on together, students are making a portfolio based off their perspectives of their experience dealing with COVID-19 and looking at primary, secondary sources for, I think we did 1918 influenza. That's right. So we would want students to be able to ask questions about both those events and to be able to explain why they think those questions are important. And if we keep scrolling, we see there's even more standards for compelling questions. This chapter is actually the shortest, and so we'll kind of stick with it, just a couple of these as we work into it. So we're going to go ahead and start jumping into our lesson plan, and we're going to see how we develop those compelling questions. All right, so we're back where we left off with our curriculum, and we can see not much has changed. We still have our summative task. We still have our taking informed action. The only thing I've changed actually since our last video is I changed COVID-19 and 1918 influenza pandemic to orange because it actually connects to our geography standard here in D2. If I scroll back up, we can see it. I crossed it out because I used it. And it talked about analyzing the effects of catastrophic environmental and technological events. And so I thought that catastrophic environmental event would connect, and so I changed it. And I'm showing you this just to remind you what we've looked at so far, but also we really want to be keeping our summative task and our taking informed action in mind, because remember, we're doing that idea of backwards design where we really want to figure out where we're driving students to. Now, here we know students have to create some kind of entries for portfolios, and they're doing it in order to share their perspective of going through the COVID-19 pandemic, but also to share their perspective for what they analyze eventually with the 1918 influenza pandemic. And we'll really focus a lot on that later, where we actually talk a little bit about what will students be analyzing to figure out that perspective. That'll be a video where we talk about like sources and where to find them. But for today, we're mostly going to focus on like what actual compelling questions and activities could students be participating in order to help them actually figure out what questions they have. So those are some of the tasks in taking informed action. If we scroll down even further, we see I've added some additional charts, or a chart down here below. I call it aligning questions with assessment. Again, our assessment is this piece. So I just showed you that. I removed all the color, but this is the exact same summative task, the exact same taking informed action. If we scroll down, we see it goes farther. And here we have a new section. We have compelling question, supporting question for part 1, staging the supporting question, formative performance task. And down here we see we have new standards to work with, and these all come from the C3 framework. See where it says D1? That means it comes from that first part of the C3 framework. So the things I just showed you, this is just them organized in a way to kind of help us figure out exactly how they're going to be organized to help us find that compelling question and supporting question. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start working on this, and we're going to come up with a compelling question that connects to our taking informed action or our summative task. And we see here I chose D1 from or D1 1.3 from the C3 framework, and it says explain why compelling questions are important to others, peers, and adults. We want students to be able to actually understand that just because you ask a question doesn't necessarily mean it deserves to be asked or answered. You need to have a reason why it matters. And I think the best way to do this for especially young students, third graders and younger, is really to come up with our own compelling questions and model for them. Explain like why we chose the question that we did, and to have them even maybe explore why it matters as a way to kind of scaffold them into what it might be like to make their own compelling question and explain why it matters. So if we're going to do this, we could actually use the standards that we haven't used yet. If we remember, I circled these, or I'm circling them now. These are the standards we've used so far, and we're color-coded. But if you remember, we've actually not used a few. These right here, we haven't used the South Dakota standards yet, and we haven't used this one from C3, the migration part. I crossed off all the other ones. And that's not to say you couldn't use those still, but since we've already used them, we don't need to really go back to them. It's just to make sure that we're well covered. So we see here we have 2 geography standards that we haven't touched on. One talks about migration, one talks about why people move. And, I kind of was wondering, like, what if we talked about why do people move because of the pandemic? Like, we know that after a year of living through this pandemic, that people moved in different ways. Sometimes they moved back with family. Sometimes they moved back to their original community. Sometimes they moved to a different community. Also, it stopped people moving. Migration is also not just about why people move, but sometimes why people don't move. Some people migrate to a certain part and then get stuck someplace. So we could talk about that too. I think the students would all have a story that they could share about that. So we have these 2 standards that we know about. It's about geography, it's about movement. So if we scroll back down, I already wrote one, so I can just go ahead and go to it. Oop, wrong way. There we go. How do pandemics influence where people go? That could be the big, compelling question that we work with, and we could use that as a driving force to help push students to this taking informed action. So we would explore this question, but we'd also want students to make up their own compelling questions. And we're going to touch on that in here when we start having them look at sources, look at information, and really start thinking about like what kind of things do they want to do too. All right, so now that we have our compelling question, we need to go into our supporting question for part 1. And if you remember, the lesson plan that I shared has 3 parts, and I do that because I like to build curriculum with multiple parts in mind. And those parts might be stretched across a really large part of time. So if you had 90 minutes or 2 hours to work on this lesson, I know some teachers have asked me how can we spend 2 hours on a single social studies inquiry in the same day? You could potentially mix it in with your reading and writing standards. You could even mix it in sometimes with a science standard. Geography, for example, has a lot of different science aspects, especially physical science that you could work with. So if you want to do that, you can, but also you could stretch it across, the same 3 days or an entire week. I would say for younger students, the tighter the time, the better. So if you can do a single inquiry within the same block of time, that's best. But again, do whatever you can that works for your schedule. So we need to find a way to explain how supporting questions help answer compelling questions. If we remember from my description of C3 or when I showed you, it's simpler. So what are the these simple pieces that we're going to need for students to understand? And if we scroll back to our standards that we haven't really touched on yet, I actually have already crossed them off, but we can still see the bolded part. We probably have some words here that we want to explain to students. So for example, we might want to explain what that word community actually means. Like, what does it mean to be a part of a community? So I can scroll down here, for example, and write, what does it mean to be part of a community? Or what is a community? These are all questions I think would relate really well. Going back up to the standards that we're using. Analyze the effects of catastrophic environmental events and migration. I think those are other words that we're going to have to explain. So what is a catastrophic event? You can change that word if you want. I'm going to go ahead and change this a little bit. So it tightens that up. What is migration? What does it look like for people to migrate? People to migrate. Gotta sound it out. All right. So these are all different questions I think you could ask. And again, the supporting questions are driving the compelling question. And part of C3 and part of inquiry in general is for students to come up with their own. So be keeping in mind that this is for part 1. So really we're just trying to show students exactly what we're doing, or like what we would like them to do by giving them a model. So we come up with this compelling question. We come up with these supporting questions in order to show them what it looks like, and all the while we're asking them to participate. We're asking them, like, what do you think of our compelling question? What do you think of our supporting question? And that might look like, for example, here, like, what is a community? That could be a bell ringer. That could be a very simple writing reflection the kids do. So if you want kids to practice writing, 2 or 3 sentences together, maybe you ask them that question, what is a community? So not only are you asking a social studies question, you're also having them practice their writing. You could even have them practice their oral ability, their speaking ability, their communication ability by having them present to each other. So maybe turn to your table partner and say these things. This is all how it could work. And again, we're pulling these straight from the standards that is all driving over to this taking informed action. So students are going to have plenty of different chances to answer questions, which then they could, write those answers to those questions into their portfolio with these 5 entries. And just for the sake of time, when I was talking, I realized I was already kind of answering number 3. This idea of like staging the supporting question. So what's the warm-up we can be doing? I talked about that idea of like define community and have students write 3 sentences about it. And again, that is a way of setting these interpretations up, which again is leading us to this taking informed action where students are going to be able to write 5 entries. And so once they define community and write 3 sentences about it, they could maybe even go back and start asking their own compelling question, their own supporting questions, and that's part of the inquiry process, which is leading us to that portfolio piece. And then again, finally, for sake of time, I already wrote out this last piece here. So if you want to pause me and read these, you're more than welcome to. But I wrote, for the first chapter of our portfolio, we are going to talk about how our community changed because of COVID-19. Who did we get to see more? Who did we get to see less? And I'm connecting this all together. This connects to the compelling question that I wrote, the supporting questions, the warm-up activity, and our final piece. I talk about the portfolio that we're building with each other, these first 5 entries, right? The 5 entries could maybe be one chapter that we focus on. And this connects to these pieces too, because students are talking about COVID-19. And again, eventually we're going to bring up the 1918 influenza pandemic. So I see this as a way of opening up the activity where students get to be introduced to the idea of what it's like to create a compelling question, ask supporting ones, do something with those supporting questions, and then again, finally, start building this big piece that they're doing. And I've done a lot of stuff that's connecting to writing and communicating. So I know some teachers have asked me or have talked about this idea of how on earth do we fit all these big inquiries together, and I think we're already doing the work, right? We're already creating writing projects or reading projects. We're already doing group work with our students. And the really only difference with this is we're making sure it connects to a really large piece at the very end that's taking informed action that also connects to our standards. So if we scroll back up, we see that we've hit now all of our standards, perhaps except for this one, although I would argue we have because we are creating primary sources, but we still need to focus on that historical piece that passed, and so we'll do that next time. But we've hit all these other ones, including the Oceti-Sakowin standards, because that oral tradition is being done through our students. If we think about this oral tradition down here, they're the ones telling us who is in part of their community. They're the ones who are writing this community. I could even write an extra piece right here and say students must share with one another out loud. And you can either write in table partners or as a whole class, depending on how much time you have. And that is carrying over that oral tradition that we see in those OSEU standards. So this is what it looks like to take an informed action, start creating compelling questions, and have it drive. And then, next time we're going to really work on finding primary sources for those history standards and really just kind of tying all these different assessments together. All right, so that wraps up our time looking at compelling and supporting questions. Like I said in the beginning of the video, the Dimension 1 in the C3 framework is pretty brief, so if you'd like to read it, it won't take you that long to do so feel free. However, I know a lot of teachers have already done a good job of creating questions, but I know from last summer when we were doing this is one of the bigger, challenges that teachers have, this idea of doing compelling questions and writing supporting questions to go along with them. So I hope me modeling that process will be beneficial for you. Also, remember, these modeling videos go along with the lesson plan that I'm constructing, and that's available to you as well. If you have no idea where to find that, please let me know. I can help. Also, Melinda Johnson's a great contact person. She's our specialist of social studies at the Department of Education in South Dakota. So again, that is all for me. We're going to go ahead and wrap up, and next time we're talking about assessments, and so we're going to talk about not only how are we creating these activities, but a little bit also on what does it actually look like to grade these things, especially in a formative way. I want to talk a lot about grading and assessing in a way where students can use your observations and assessment in order to become better. So that's what we'll do next time. Until then, take care.